The first sound to reach the hole was not a shot, but a whistle, thin and metallic, carried down the ridge on a wind that had been killing men quietly all night. And behind that whistle came the bugles. And behind the bugles came the lead assault battalions of the Chinese Ninth Army Group, pouring out of the black tree line above Toktung Pass, in numbers that no flare could fully light. They came in a single coordinated rush, the way that army had been trained to come, the forward elements absorbing the first rifle fire, so the ranks behind could close the final 40 yards before the defenders understood how many were already inside the wire. By the time the third flare cracked open above the saddle and turned the snow the color of bone, the Chinese spearhead had already torn through the seam between two Marine fighting positions, killed the men in them, and rolled on toward the crest. And the whole forward slope of the hill seemed to be moving, a dark tide climbing toward a line that was no longer a line, pressed into a shallow scrape near the lowest fold of that slope, separated from the rest of his squad by the angle of the ground and by the speed of the assault, lay a single Marine who had not had time to lace his boots. He had pulled them off hours earlier to work the circulation back into feet that had gone the dead gray of the men around him. And when the bugles started, he had grabbed his rifle and rolled into the nearest hole in his stocking feet. And now, there was no going back for the boots and no time to think about it. He was low on grenades and lower on ammunition. He was alone at the point of the hill where the enemy had chosen to break through. He was, in that first minute, the only thing standing between the assault and the open road behind the pass, and he almost certainly did not know it yet. Around him, the rest of the company was learning the same lesson at the same moment all along the ridge. Fox Company of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, roughly 240 men when the sun went down, had been set on this single bald hill above the pass for one reason, which was that the pass was the only road. Behind them, to the southeast, sat the supply base at Hagorurai. Ahead of them, to the northwest, the bulk of 2 Marine regiments was strung out around the frozen reservoir at Udumnai, and the narrow track that connected the two ran directly under the muzzles of this hill. Cut the hill, and the road closed. Close the road, and the regiments at the reservoir were sealed inside the trap. The Chinese commanders understood this with perfect clarity. That is why they had sent not a patrol but a reinforced regiment against a single reinforced company, and why the men climbing the slope outnumbered the men on the crest, by a margin that no amount of training was supposed to survive. The cold made the margin worse. The temperature on the ridge had fallen past -20 and was still falling, and the wind that funneled through the pass drove the felt of it down toward -30 and lower in the gusts. At that temperature, the war stopped being only a matter of men and bullets, and became a matter of physics. Rifle bolts froze half open. Oil thickened in the actions until the weapons cycled like rusted hinges or did not cycle at all. The lubricant that was supposed to keep a machine gun firing instead glued its parts together, so that gunners learned to strip the oil off entirely and run the guns dry, knowing the metal would wear but trusting that wear was a slower death than a frozen receiver. Grenades had to be kept inside a man's clothing against his own failing body heat, or they would not reliably go off. Plasma froze in the bottle. Morphine froze in the syrette, and a corpsman who wanted to dull a wounded man's pain had to thaw the little tube in his mouth first, holding it under his tongue while the firing went on around him. The hill was trying to kill the Marines from the inside, even as the Ninth Army Group tried to kill them from the outside, and the assault had timed itself to arrive at the worst hour of the worst night, when every defender was already half numb and slow. The lone Marine in the forward scrape felt all of it and fought through none of it, because there was no time. The first Chinese soldiers to reach his stretch of slope did not see him at once. They were moving fast and looking up the hill toward the crest, expecting the resistance to come from above, and he let them come and then began to work. He fired low and deliberate into the mass, not aiming at any single man but at the place where the next man would have to step, and the bodies that fell became their own obstacle, a low dark wall that the men behind had to climb over, and that slowed them just enough. He was firing a weapon that wanted to freeze, and an action he had to force by hand between shots, and still he kept it talking. And for a few seconds the rush in front of him bent away from his hole, and toward the easier ground to his flank. That bend was the first small victory, and it lasted no time at all. The assault did not need his stretch of slope. It only needed the crest, and so it flowed past and around him. And within a minute he was no longer in front of the attack but inside it, with Chinese soldiers above him and below him, and moving on both sides through the dark. A lesser instinct would have been to go still, to sink into the hole and let the tide pass and hope to be missed. He did the opposite. He understood in the wordless arithmetic of a man who has decided to fight that a hole the enemy has flowed past is a hole that can fire into the enemy's back. And so he turned in the scrape and began shooting uphill into the same mass he had just been shooting at from the front. And the soldiers climbing toward the crest began to fall from behind for reasons they could not immediately see. Up on the crest, the rest of Fox's company was disintegrating into a series of separate fights. The neat geometry of the defensive line, the interlocking fields of fire that had been so carefully laid before dark, had survived for perhaps 3 minutes of the assault and then ceased to exist. The Chinese had hit the seams, exactly the seams, with a precision that told the Marines they had been watched all day, every position registered, every gap measured, by men lying motionless in the snow within 50 yards of the wire and never seen. Now those gaps were full of enemy. A platoon on the high shoulder of the hill was overrun in the first rush, its survivors falling back across open ground toward the company command position, with the assault right behind them, so that for a stretch of murderous seconds it was impossible to fire without hitting friend as well as foe. Officers and sergeants who tried to stand and rally the line were among the first to die, because the assault had been told to find them and kill them, and the men who had carried the plan in their heads went down with the plan still in their heads, and the defense on the crest became a thing of instinct and individual stubbornness, with no one left to coordinate it. In the gap the lone Marine had created on the lower slope, the assault began to lose its shape. The men climbing the hill behind the spearhead had counted on a clean lane, and instead they were taking fire from below, from a single position they could not locate in the dark and the muzzle flash and the blowing snow. They began to drift, some of them turning to deal with the fire at their backs, and the moment they turned they stopped feeding the push toward the crest. And the crest, for one ragged interval, held. None of the men on the crest knew why. They knew only that the pressure on one shoulder of the hill had eased a fraction, just enough to let a handful of survivors reform a stub of a firing line. They used that fraction the way drowning men use a single breath. The Marine in the forward hole, meanwhile, ran out of the easy part of the fight. His rifle ammunition was going fast, faster than he could afford, and the weapon itself was fighting him now, the frozen action seizing more often, each shot requiring more force on the bolt than the last. He could feel the night turning against the steel in his hands. So he did the thing that men in his position have always done, which is to reach for whatever was within arm's length and make it into a weapon. There were grenades scattered in the snow around the overrun positions nearby, dropped by the dead and the dying, and there were grenades on the bodies of the men who had fallen in front of his hole. He began to gather them. He pulled them in toward the scrape, a few at a time, crawling out into the killing ground between rushes and dragging back what he could find. And he built himself a small stock of the only thing that still worked reliably at -30, the only weapon that did not care whether its oil had frozen. The grenade duel that followed went on for hours and had a logic all its own. The Chinese had grenades too, stick grenades and the small fragmentation type, and they threw them down the slope into the Marine positions in showers. And a grenade that lands in a fighting hole gives a man somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds to do something about it. The lone Marine learned to do something about it. He learned the arc of the thing in the dark by the sputter of its fuse, and he learned to scoop it up out of the bottom of the hole and throw it back uphill before it went off. into the men who had thrown it. And the math of that exchange was savage. Most men cannot do it once. He did it again and again through the worst hours of the night, snatching live grenades out of the snow at his feet and returning them to the slope. And each one he sent back was one that did not kill him, and might kill the enemy, and the slope in front of his hole filled with the consequences. It could not last. It did not last cleanly. At some point in that exchange, a grenade he reached for did not give him the time he needed, and it went off as he was getting his hand to it, and it took part of the hand and tore into his arm. And the fight after that was a one-handed fight, conducted by a man who was now bleeding into the snow, and temperatures cold enough to slow the bleeding into a black crust even as it weakened him. He kept fighting anyway, and here the story stops being only about one hole on one slope, and becomes about the whole frozen geometry of the campaign, because the hill the lone Marine was holding was a single knuckle of bone in a much larger trap that was closing all along the reservoir at the same hour. The Chinese Ninth Army Group had not come to Korea to win a battle. It had come to annihilate a corps. Roughly 120,000 men of that army group had crossed the Yalu in secret over the preceding weeks, moving only at night, hiding by day under snow and brush and camouflage, so disciplined that the aircraft hunting them saw nothing, marching hundreds of miles into the mountains on rations that had already begun to fail. And they had taken station in the high ground around the reservoir in total silence and waited for the United Nations columns to walk into the bowl. The plan was to let the Marines and the Army units string themselves out along the single road, then sever that road in a dozen places at once, isolate each fragment, and destroy the fragments one at a time before any of them could be relieved. Tokdong Pass was one of those dozen cuts. Fox Hill was the cork in it, and the assault now grinding against a one-handed Marine on the lower slope was the same assault, in miniature, that was being pressed against every isolated position in the mountains that night. The same whistle, the same bugles, the same tide of men coming out of the dark in numbers meant to swamp resistance by sheer mass before the cold and the terrain could be turned against them. The architect of that trap, the commander of the Ninth Army Group, was a man named Song Shilun, and he was nowhere near Fox Hill and did not need to be. His plan was the villain on the slope, expressed through the bodies of the soldiers executing it, and his plan was very nearly perfect. He had achieved complete surprise. He had cut the road. He had isolated the Marine regiments at the reservoir from the base at Hagar-Rurai exactly as he intended. And the only flaw in the design, the single variable his planning could not account for, was that the cork in the most important cut refused to come out. The pass had to fall for the trap to fully close, and the pass would not fall, and the reason it would not fall was being decided that night by a few score half-frozen Marines on a bald hill, and by one of them in particular, in his stocking feet, in a scrape on the lower slope, with one hand and a dwindling pile of other men's grenades. What Song Shilun could not see from his maps, and what the soldiers climbing the slope could not see in the dark, was that the cold was no longer a neutral force. It had begun to choose sides. The Chinese assault formations had marched into the mountains carrying almost nothing, because almost nothing could be carried that far through that terrain without being seen. Their supply line had effectively collapsed before the first shot. The men in the assault wore quilted cotton uniforms and canvas shoes, and many of them had been lying motionless in the snow for the better part of a day, and a night to achieve the surprise that made the assault possible. And the price of that surprise was paid in flesh. Frostbite moved through the waiting ranks like a second enemy. Whole units arrived at the line of departure already crippled, fingers too frozen to work a trigger, feet swollen black inside the canvas shoes. And the genius of the timing that had brought them undetected to within 50 yards of the Marines was also the trap that had frozen them stiff before they could spring it. The assault came on with overwhelming numbers, and with a terrible portion of those numbers already half dead, and the men who were still able to fight had to do the work of the men who could not, and the hill drank them faster than the plan had allowed for. On the crest, Through the long middle of the night, Fox Company fought the same fight in dozens of separate holes. The pattern repeated until it became a kind of grim metronome. A bugle, a whistle, a rush of men out of the dark leaning into the marine fire, climbing over their own dead to close the distance. And then, if the line held, a recoil back into the tree line to reform, and then a pause, and then another bugle. Each rush cost the defenders ammunition they could not replace and men they could not replace. And each rush cost the attackers far more, but the attackers had far more to spend. The arithmetic still favored the slope. A company cannot trade evenly with a regiment and survive, and so the only way for the company to survive was to make the trade so lopsided that the regiment broke first, and the only way to do that was for individual Marines to hold individual ground far past the point at which holding made sense. All over the hill, men were doing exactly that, and on the lower slope, the loneliest of them was doing it harder than anyone, because the enemy kept choosing his ground to break through, again and again, drawn to the same seam, and he kept being there, and he kept refusing to let it open. By the deepest hour of the night, the lone Marine had stopped keeping count of anything. He had stopped counting the rushes he had broken, and the grenades he had thrown back, and the times the frozen rifle had seized in his hand. He had bled enough that the cold and the blood loss were braided together into a single gray weight pressing down on him, and the edges of his vision had begun to do the thing that edges do when a body is shutting its outer systems down to keep the core alive. Around his hole, the slope was no longer ground. It was a low, broken landscape of the men the assault had spent against him, and the men still alive among them had begun, here and there, to crawl rather than charge, working forward through their own dead toward the position that would not die. He could hear them more than see them. He fought by sound now as much as by sight, by the crunch of a canvas shoe breaking the snow crust, by the soft metallic tick of a grenade arming, and he answered each sound with whatever he had left, and he had almost nothing left, and still the seam did not open. And then, in the blackness before the first gray of dawn, the metronome stopped. The bugles went quiet, the whistles went quiet. The slope, which had not been silent for hours, fell into a silence so total that the men in the holes could hear the wind again and their own ragged breathing, and the small sounds of the wounded. And every Marine still alive on that hill understood exactly what the silence meant. It did not mean the enemy had given up. It meant the enemy was reforming for the largest push of the night. Out in the dark, beyond the range of the dying flares, the assault was gathering itself for the pre-dawn rush, the one the Chinese always saved for the hour when the defenders were emptiest, and the ammunition was gone, and the cold had done its worst, and the will to stand had been worn down to its last thread. The lone Marine on the lower slope, with one ruined hand and a frozen rifle, and a few grenades left in the snow at the bottom of his hole, lay still in that silence and listened to 200 men. He could not yet see arrange themselves in the dark for the charge that was meant to finish the hill, and he did not move, and he did not call out, and he waited. When the charge came, it came without bugles, and that was the worst sign of all, because it meant the assault had abandoned the careful staging of the earlier rushes, and committed everything it had left to a single mass that no longer needed signals to coordinate it, since there was nothing left to coordinate except the act of running uphill into the guns. 200 men, or something near it, broke from the dark tree line above the saddle in one body, and came down across the open slope at the run, and the lone Marine in the forward scrape heard them before the last flare showed them, heard the crust of the snow breaking under hundreds of canvas shoes at once, a sound like a great sheet of ice giving way, and he gathered the last of the grenades into the crook of his ruined arm, and waited for the slope to fill. It filled. The flare went up, fired by someone on the crest who understood as well as he did what the silence had meant, and the magnesium light caught the whole charge in mid-stride, a frozen instant of hundreds of men leaning into the hill, and then the light steadied and the slope was moving again, faster than it had moved all night, and the lone Marine began to throw. He threw with one hand, pulling the pins with his teeth because the other hand was gone, and he threw not at the front of the charge but into the dense center of it, where the bodies were packed tightest, where a single fragmentation burst could reach the most men, and the center of the charge began to come apart even as its edges kept climbing. Up and down the hill the rest of Fox Company did the same with whatever it had left, the surviving machine guns running dry and hot, and refusing for once to freeze, because they had not stopped firing long enough to cool, the riflemen firing into a target so dense that aim had become irrelevant. The pre-dawn charge that was meant to finish the hill ran headlong into a defense that had decided, individually in dozens of separate holes, that it would not be finished. The charge reached the lower positions. It reached the lone Marine scrape, and for a span of seconds that no one afterward could measure, the fight on the lower slope was hand to hand, was men in the hole and at its lip, was the Marine swinging the frozen rifle as a club, because there was no time to make it fire. And still the seam did not open, because the man holding it would not let go of it even with one hand, even bleeding, even with the charge breaking over him like surf over a rock that does not care how many waves have come before. And then the rock won. The charge, which had spent the last organized strength of the assault battalion in that final rush, broke against the hill and recoiled. This time when it recoiled it did not reform. The survivors streamed back up the slope toward the tree line in ones and twos and small ragged clots, no longer an assault but a remnant, and the fire from the Marine holes followed them up the hill and cut at them all the way to the trees. And when the last of them reached the dark and vanished into it, the slope was still, and it stayed still, and the stillness this time was different. It was not the gathering silence before another push. It was the silence of an attack that had nothing left to gather. The lone Marine lay in the bottom of his scrape, with the empty rifle across his chest, and the last unthrown grenade still in his hand, and listened to that silence stretch out and become minutes, and the minutes became the first thin gray line along the eastern ridges. And the dawn that the title of his whole night had promised began, impossibly, to arrive. It arrived on a landscape that the daylight made almost unbelievable, as the gray strengthened into the flat, cold light of a Korean winter morning. The men of Fox Company lifted their heads above their holes and saw, for the first time, the full account of what the night had cost the enemy. The slope below the crest was carpeted. The bodies of the Chinese assault lay where the fire had dropped them, in the windrows that mass charges always leave, thickest where the seams had been hit hardest, and thickest of all on the lower slope, in front of one particular scrape, where they lay in a fan that radiated out from the hole, as if the hole had been the center of a wheel, and the dead its spokes. The snow between them was no longer white. The Marines counted what they could and stopped counting, because counting served no purpose. The numbers were past the point where a number meant anything. The assault had thrown itself against the hill all night, and the hill had held, and the price the hill had charged for holding was written across the slope, in a language that needed no translation, and the men reading it were too exhausted and too cold to feel anything about it except a dull animal relief that they were the ones still able to read. But the morning brought no rest, because the morning only revealed the size of the problem rather than solving it. Fox Company had survived the night, but survival was not the same as deliverance. The company was still alone on the hill. The road through the pass was still cut, not by the assault, which had failed, but by the simple fact that the Chinese still held the high ground all around the pass, and could fire on anything that tried to move through it. The regiments at the reservoir were still sealed in the trap, and the 9th Army Group, which had lost a battalion against this single hill in a single night, had a great many more battalions and would be back. And the men of Fox Company knew with perfect clarity that they would have to do the whole thing again the next night, and the night after that, with fewer men and less ammunition, and no more feeling in their feet than they had now, which was to say almost none. The lone Marine was carried up to the company position when the light was strong enough to move him, his hand a frozen ruin, and his arm a dead weight, and his feet in their ruined socks, the color and texture of meat left out in the cold. and the corpsemen who worked on him did what little could be done with morphine they had to thaw in their own mouths, and bandages that froze stiff the moment they were exposed, and they set him among the other wounded in the shallow depression that served as an aid station. And there he became part of the second siege, the daylight siege, the siege of simply staying alive on the hill long enough for someone to come. That someone was, at that moment, more than 4 miles away by the road, and very much further than that by the only route that mattered. And the story of the relief is the story of why the trap that Song Shilan had built so perfectly failed at the one point where its failure mattered most. The Marine commanders at the reservoir understood, as clearly as the Chinese did, that Foxhole was the cork in the bottle, and they understood that if the cork came out the regiments at Udumnai were finished. And so they did the arithmetic, and concluded that the hill had to be relieved at a cost they would normally never pay. The road was impossible. The road ran for miles under enemy guns through ground the Chinese held on both sides, and any column that tried to fight its way up the road would be doing exactly what the trap was designed to punish, stringing itself out in a narrow lane to be cut into pieces. So the relief would not take the road. It would do the one thing the trap did not expect, the one thing that was almost as hard as the thing Fox Company was already doing, which was to leave the road entirely and go over the mountains in the dark and the cold, cross-country, over the ridgelines, through the same snow that was killing both armies, and come down onto the hill from the high ground the enemy thought was theirs. The battalion chosen for that march was the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under a commander named Raymond Davis, and what that battalion did over the following 30-odd hours belongs in the same account as what Fox Company did on the hill, because the two efforts were the same effort viewed from opposite ends. Davis took his men off the road after dark and into the trackless high country, abandoning the relative ease of the valley, for ground so broken and so cold that the march itself became a battle against the same enemy that was freezing the men in the holes. The battalion climbed in column through snow that came past the knee, over ridgelines swept by a wind that drove the cold past the threshold, where exposed skin freezes in minutes, and the men carried their weapons and their wounded, and their ammunition up and down a series of frozen ridges in the dark, navigating by compass, because there was nothing else to navigate by, and they fought through Chinese blocking positions on the high ground as they went, because the enemy held the heights, and the heights were exactly where the battalion had to go. Men froze on that march. Men who sat down to rest did not always get up, and the column learned to keep moving for the simple reason that motion was the only source of heat, and the battalion drove itself over the mountains on the knowledge that at the far end of the suffering there was a hill full of men who had been suffering longer and could not last much more. On the hill, the daylight siege ground on with a different rhythm than the night. By day the Chinese could not mass for the great charges, because by day the Marines had the air, and the air over Fox Hill in the daylight hours was a thing the men in the holes came to love, with an intensity that nothing in their lives before the war had prepared them for. Corsairs came up from the south, and from the carriers off the coast, blue gull-winged aircraft that fell on the tree lines around the hill, where the enemy was massing for the next night's work, and they came in so low and so precise that the Marines could direct them onto targets within 100 yards of their own holes, and the napalm they laid into the draws where the Chinese sheltered did the one thing that nothing else on that hill could do, which was to bring warmth, a terrible second-hand warmth that the freezing men in the holes actually turned their faces toward even as it burned the enemy out of the high ground. The aircraft could not hold the hill. They could not stay through the night when the cold drove them off and the charges came, but they could break up the daylight buildup, and they could drop ammunition and medical supplies, and the occasional bundle of the things the company needed most, and they kept the daylight siege from becoming a second night's assault before the actual night arrived, and that was enough to buy the hours that the march over the mountains needed. The lone Marine, lying among the wounded through that first day, was not done fighting. This is the part of the account that strains belief, and is nonetheless consistent with everything the knight had already shown about him. Because a man who has held a seam alone with one hand does not become a passive casualty simply because someone has laid him on a stretcher. When the daylight probes came, the small testing attacks the Chinese sent against the hill to keep the pressure on, and to find the soft places for the night. The wounded who could still hold a weapon were propped at the edge of the aid station, and given what ammunition could be spared, because every man who could fire was needed, and there were not enough unwounded men left to man the line. He took a weapon in his good hand. He could not throw any longer, and he could not work a bolt with a ruined hand, but he could lie behind a rifle laid across a mound of frozen earth, and fire it slowly and deliberately into the probes, the same low and patient fire he had used in the first minute of the first assault. And he did, and the men around him who were whole drew something from the sight of a man that broken refusing still to stop. And the line held through the probes by day as it had held through the charges by night. The second night came, and with it the charges returned. And Fox Company, smaller now, with the wounded fighting from the aid station, and the dead stacked where the frozen ground would not take them, did the whole thing again. The bugles, the whistles, the rush out of the dark, the grenade duels in the holes, the frozen weapons forced by hand, the metronome of attack and recoil that ate ammunition and men, and would not stop. The lone Marine fought that night too, from his place at the edge of the wounded, firing his slow, patient fire into the rushes when they came within the reach of his good hand. And the hill held a second night as it had held the first, and the cost to the enemy mounted into figures that the daylight again declined to make countable. The company was being ground down. Every night took men it could not replace. The ammunition that the aircraft dropped by day was never quite enough to refill what the night spent, and the cold never relented, and the wounded in the aid station grew more numerous, and the men on the line grew fewer, and the simple downward arithmetic of a single company holding against an army began slowly to assert itself despite everything the men did to defy it. Fox Hill could not hold forever. It could only hold until relief arrived. And the question that hung over the third day, unspoken because speaking it served no purpose, was whether the relief would arrive before the arithmetic finished its work. It arrived on the morning that the march over the mountains finally crested the high ground above the hill. Davis and his battalion, having fought and frozen their way across the ridgelines through a second night of their own, came down at last onto the high shoulder above Fox Company's position. And the first the men on the hill knew of it was a change in the character of the fighting on the heights above them. A sudden pressure on the Chinese from a direction the Chinese had assumed was safe. The relief did not come up the road into the teeth of the trap. It came down out of the mountains onto the back of the enemy, holding the high ground, exactly the reverse of what the trap was built to punish. And the blocking positions that had sealed the pass found themselves taken from above and behind by men who had done the impossible thing of crossing the mountains to get there. And they broke. The link-up, when it came, was not a dramatic thing of waving flags and shouted reunions, because the men on both ends of it were too far gone for drama. It was a quiet thing, a thinning of the enemy, and then a trickle of fresh Marines coming down onto the hill from the high ground, men whose faces were as frozen and as gray as the faces of the men they were relieving, carrying ammunition and carrying the simple decisive fact of their presence. And the siege of Fox Hill, after 5 days and 5 nights, came to an end not with a victory charge, but with the arrival of more men willing to be cold and to fight. What the relief found on the hill when it arrived is the final measure of what had been done there. Of the roughly 240 men of Fox Company who had set up on the hill when the first whistle came, a small and savagely reduced remnant were still able to stand and hold a weapon. The rest were dead, or wounded, or frozen past the point of fighting, and the ground they had held was ringed with the enemy they had stopped. And the road through the pass, which the entire trap had been built to close, was still open because the cork had never come out. The regiments at the reservoir, sealed in the bowl for those 5 days, now had the one thing the trap had been designed to deny them, which was a way out, and they took it. The breakout from the reservoir, the long fighting withdrawal down the single road through the pass that Fox Company had kept open, became one of the hardest and most disciplined operations of the entire war. 2 divisions worth of men fighting their way down a frozen road through an army that had come to destroy them. And every yard of that road ran past the hill, and the hill held the whole time the column was passing, because the hill holding was the only reason there was a column to pass at all. A lone Marine went down off the hill on a stretcher when the wounded were finally moved, carried down through the wreckage of the assault he had broken, past the fan of the dead that still radiated out from a scrape on the lower slope that no one bothered any longer to explain. And he was alive, which was itself a kind of verdict, because the great majority of the men who do what he had done are not. He had held a seam alone against the spearhead of a regiment on the first night. He had thrown back grenades with 2 hands and then with 1. He had fought from a stretcher for 2 more days after the wound that should have ended him. He had been one man among many who held the hill, and the holding was a company's achievement and not a single man's. And yet the company's achievement had turned, on the worst night, on individual men holding individual ground past the point where holding made any sense. And on the lower slope, at the place the enemy kept choosing to break through, the individual man who held it had been him. The trap that Song Shilan built had been very nearly perfect. It had failed at one hill, and the reason it had failed at that hill was lying on a stretcher with a ruined hand and frozen feet, being carried down toward the road he had kept open, and he did not say anything about it, because there was nothing to say, and because the account of what he had done was already written, in the snow, in the windrows of the dead, in the simple surviving fact of the open road. There remains the matter of the cold, which had been the Third Army on that hill all along, and which deserves a final accounting, because it shaped everything the men did, and everything the enemy could not do. The Ninth Army Group had marched into the mountains to fight the Marines and had ended by fighting the winter, and the winter had taken from it a toll that no battle could have inflicted. Entire formations of that army were destroyed not by fire but by frost, men frozen in their firing positions, in the act of waiting for an order that the cold had already made it impossible for them to obey. Whole companies found later sitting in their holes in the attitudes of soldiers ready to attack, dead where they sat, killed by the same surprise and the same discipline that had brought them undetected to the line. The army that had been built to swallow a corps was itself swallowed, in large part, by the mountains it had used to hide. And the Marines, who had suffered terribly from the same cold, had suffered less in the end, because they had the air and the supply drops, and the warming halts and the simple institutional refusal to let the cold win that had men stamping their feet and working their hands through the worst of every night. And the margin between an army that the cold crippled and an army that the cold merely punished turned out to be one of the decisive margins of the whole campaign. Fox Company had won its hill against men, and the cold had won the larger battle against the army those men belonged to. And the 2 victories together kept the road open and let the corps escape the trap. The hill itself kept the name the Marines gave it. It was a bald and nameless knuckle of ground above a frozen pass before that night, one terrain feature among 10,000 identical ones in those mountains, and it became, by virtue of what was done on it, a fixed point in the history of the regiment that held it, the kind of place whose name is spoken afterward without explanation, because the explanation is understood. Men who were not there learned the name. The stand on the hill became one of the things by which the whole frozen campaign was measured, a single clarifying instance of the thing the campaign was full of, which was small numbers of men holding impossible ground against overwhelming numbers in killing cold and refusing to break. And at the center of the hill's story, on the lower slope, at the seam the enemy kept choosing, there was the scrape, and in the scrape there had been one man, in his stocking feet, with a frozen rifle and other men's grenades, and finally only one working hand, and the fan of the dead in the snow in front of his hole, was the thing he left behind in place of any words, and it said everything, and it was enough. The road through Tokdong Pass stayed open until the last man of the column had passed down it, and then the Marines who had held the pass came down off their hills and joined the rear of the column and went down the road themselves, relieved and the relievers together, the survivors of Fox Company and the survivors of the battalion that had crossed the mountains to reach them, all of them moving south down the single frozen track toward the sea, fighting as they went, carrying their wounded and their dead, leaving behind them the hills and the holes and the windrows in the snow. The lone Marine went south with them, on his stretcher alive. The hill stood empty behind the column, scattered with the evidence of everything that had happened on it. And the dawn he had held it until had long since become day, and the day had become the next day, and the next. And the man who had held the hill alone until that first dawn had held it, in the end, until there was a road south for him to be carried down, which was the only ending the night had ever been fighting toward. That is the closed loop of it. A whistle on the wind, a tide of men out of the dark, a perfect trap built by a patient commander 100 miles away, and one hill that would not fall, and one seam on that hill that would not open, and one man in stocking feet who would not let it. The villain was the plan, expressed in 200 running men in the pre-dawn dark, and the plan was beaten by a single obstacle it could not account for, and could not remove, and the road stayed open, and the Corps lived, and the cold took the army that had built the trap. And at the center of all of it, when the daylight finally came and made the accounting possible, there was the scrape on the lower slope, and the fan of the dead around it, the quiet arithmetic of a man who had decided, with no one to see him decide it, that the hill behind him was not going to fall on his watch, and then made the decision true with the only things he had, which were a frozen rifle, a dwindling pile of grenades, one hand, and the simple refusal to stop. That refusal is the whole story, and the hill is its monument, and the open road is its proof. To understand why the hill could not simply be abandoned, and why two efforts as costly as Fox Company's stand and Davis's march were spent to keep one knuckle of frozen ground, it helps to look at the map the way the Chinese had looked at it, because the Chinese had looked at it for weeks before the first whistle and had measured it down to the meter. The single road from the reservoir to the base ran for 11 miles, and along those 11 miles, there were perhaps 4 places where high ground pinched the road so tightly that a company on the heights could close it completely. And Tokdong Pass was the worst of those pinches, the place where the road bent through a narrow saddle with steep ground on both sides and no room to maneuver around a block. The force that held the pass held the road. A force that lost the pass lost the only way the regiments at the reservoir would ever come out. And there was no second road, no alternate track, no way through the mountains in winter that an army with trucks and artillery and thousands of wounded could use. The Chinese had chosen the pass because it was the throat of the whole position, and Fox Company had been set on the hill above it, because the Marine commanders had read the same map and reached the same conclusion. And so the two forces met on the one piece of ground where the entire campaign would be decided, and both of them knew it. And that knowledge was the weight that pressed down on every man in every hole through every hour of every night. The probing that filled the daylight hours between the great night assaults had a cold logic to it, that the Marines came to read the way a hunted animal reads the movements of the thing hunting it. The Chinese did not waste their daylight throwing mass charges into the teeth of the air, because the air punished mass without mercy. But they did not let the hill rest either. They sent small parties forward in the folds of the ground, 4 men or 6 men working from dead space to dead space, probing for the holes that had gone quiet in the night, the positions where the defenders had died and not been replaced, testing the line the way a man tests thin ice, putting weight on it a little at a time to find where it would break. Each probe that found a soft place marked it for the night. Each probe the Marines drove off told the enemy nothing except that the place was still held. And so the daylight became a slow and patient duel of information. the Chinese mapping the dying line one quiet attack at a time, the Marines spending their thinnest reserves of ammunition and their thinnest reserves of able-bodied men to keep the map from being completed. And the lone Marine at the edge of the aid station was part of that duel, firing his slow, deliberate fire into the probes that came within reach of his good hand, helping to keep one more soft place from being marked, buying the line one more night of not knowing it was already half gone. The supply drops that the aircraft made by day were a lifeline and a torment in equal measure, because the things the company needed most came down out of the sky into ground that was contested, and recovering them meant going out into the open, under the eyes of the enemy on the heights. The transports came over low and slow and pushed the bundles out, ammunition and grenades and medical supplies and rations, and on one drop, the mortar rounds that the company's surviving tubes needed more than they needed food, and the bundles fell where the wind and the speed of the aircraft put them, which was not always inside the perimeter. Men went out after them. Men crawled into the killing ground between the hill and the tree line to drag back a bundle of grenades while the rest of the line covered them. And some of the men who went out did not come back, and the company did the brutal arithmetic of that too, weighing the grenades in the bundle against the man it would cost to fetch them, and fetching them anyway, because grenades were the one weapon the cold could not freeze and the night could not be survived without them. The lone Marine, who could not crawl out after bundles any longer, watched the men who could, and understood the trade they were making, because it was the same trade he had made on the first night, when he crawled out of his scrape between rushes to gather the grenades of the dead. And the company was now making at the scale of a company the exact bargain he had made alone in the dark. The march over the mountains, meanwhile, was failing, and not failing in the way that all hard things fail and do not fail at the same time, which is to say it was costing more than anyone had budgeted and arriving anyway. Davis had taken his battalion off the road into country that had no roads, and no tracks and no shelter and no warmth, and the first miles of that march had stripped away every comfort the men had carried with them, and left only the march itself, the endless climbing and descending of ridgelines in column in the dark, the navigation by compass over ground, where one snow-covered ridge looked exactly like the next, the constant low-grade casualty of the cold that took a man here and a man there. Whenever the column halted long enough for the warmth of motion to bleed away, the battalion learned, as Fox Company had learned, that the cold was an enemy that had to be fought with the body every minute, that a halt was a danger, and a long halt was a death sentence. And so the column kept moving even when moving was agony, kept climbing even when the men at the front were breaking trail through snow past the knee, and the men at the back were walking in the packed trough the front had made and still freezing, and the whole long worm of men dragged itself over the mountains on the simple refusal to lie down. It fought as it went. The high ground it crossed was the same high ground the Chinese held, and the battalion ran into blocking positions on the ridgelines, and had to clear them in the dark, small vicious fights on frozen slopes that cost men the battalion could not spare. And each fight delayed the march, and each delay meant another hour that Fox Company had to hold, and the two clocks, the clock of the march and the clock of the hill, ran down toward each other through the long second night. There was a night on that march when the battalion had to halt on an exposed ridge, because the men could go no further without rest. And the halt was the most dangerous thing the battalion did in the whole crossing, because a halt in that cold on that ground was an invitation to the frost to finish what the distance had started. The men did not sleep so much as they stopped, and stopping in that temperature is a thing the body does not easily recover from. And the officers and sergeants moved up and down the halted column, doing the one job that mattered more than any other, which was keeping men awake, keeping men moving even in place, kicking the feet of men who had sat down and pulling up men who had lain down, because a man who lay down and slept in that cold did not always wake, and the difference between the men who came down off the mountains and the men who did not came down, in part to whether someone had been there to keep them on their feet through the halts. The battalion lost men to the cold on that ridge who never fired a shot and never saw the enemy, men whose entire war ended sitting in the snow, on a nameless ridgeline in the dark, and the battalion left them and went on, because there was a hill on the far side of the mountains, full of men who would be left in exactly the same way if the march stopped, and the march did not stop. On the hill the second great assault, when it came, found a company that had learned the first assault's lessons and applied them. And so the second night was in some ways less a chaos and more a grinding, a steady murderous exchange in which both sides knew exactly what the other would do, and did it anyway because there was no other thing to do. The Marines had tightened the perimeter, pulling the line in around the positions that could still be held, abandoning the holes where the dead lay, and shortening the front so that the thinner company could still cover it. And the Chinese came against the tightened line the same way they had come against the longer one, in rushes timed to the bugles, leaning into the fire, climbing their own dead. And the tightened line held because it was shorter, and because the men holding it had survived the first night and knew now, in their bodies, the exact thing they had to do. The lone Marine fired into that second night from his place among the wounded, and the grenade bundles fetched at such cost by day were spent into the rushes by night, and the metronome ran, attack and recoil, and the hill held a second time, and the cost to the enemy was again past counting, and the cost to the company was again men it would not get back, and the downward arithmetic ticked one notch lower, and the third day came gray and cold, and found Fox Company smaller still, and the road still open, and the relief still somewhere out in the mountains, coming. The breakout that the open road made possible was, when it finally began, a thing of such size and such discipline, that the hill which made it possible nearly disappeared inside it, the way a keystone disappears inside the arch it holds up. 2 divisions of men, with their trucks and their guns and their thousands of wounded, came down off the reservoir and onto the single road, and began the long fighting withdrawal toward the sea, and the column was miles long, and every mile of it had to be fought for, because the Chinese held the high ground along the road and contested every yard, and the column moved at the pace of its slowest vehicle, through a gauntlet of fire that never fully lifted, and the whole length of that withdrawal the column passed beneath the hill. The men of Fox Company, what was left of them, held the heights above the road while the column passed below, and they watched it pass, the trucks and the walking wounded, and the rear guards turning to fight and breaking contact and falling back, and turning to fight again, hour after hour, the whole frozen river of an army flowing south down the one road that the hill had kept open, and every man in that column who reached the sea reached it because the hill had held, and most of them never knew it, and the men on the hill who had held it were too spent to feel anything about it, except the dull recognition that the thing they had suffered for was, at last, moving past them toward safety. The lone Marine watched the column pass from his stretcher when they brought him up to the road's edge for the move south, and the fan of the dead on the lower slope was behind him and below him, frozen now and snowed over and become part of the hill, and the column went by in front of him, the living flowing past the place where so much dying had bought their passage, and he was loaded onto a vehicle and became part of the column himself, one more wounded man among thousands moving south, indistinguishable now from any of the others, his ruined hand and his frozen feet no more remarkable in that procession than any of the 10,000 other wounds the column carried with it. There was no mark on him that told the men around him what he had done. There was no way to know, looking at the stretcher, that this was the man who had held the seam alone on the first night, who had thrown the grenades back with one hand, who had fought from the aid station for 2 more days. And that anonymity was its own kind of truth about the whole campaign, which had been full of men who did impossible things in the dark with no one to see, and were then absorbed back into the mass of the suffering army with no mark on them at all, the extraordinary folded back into the ordinary, the thing that had decided the campaign, made indistinguishable from the campaign itself. What the column left behind, when the last of it had passed and the rear guard had come down off the hills, was a landscape that the war would not see the like of again. The high mountain valley scattered with the frozen evidence of everything that had happened in it. The windrows of the Chinese dead on the slopes, the abandoned holes, the burned draws where the napalm had gone in, the long churned track of the road itself, and over all of it the silence of an emptied battlefield in a cold so deep that nothing decayed and nothing moved. And the dead of both armies lay where they had fallen, as if the mountains had decided to keep them. The hill stood at the center of it, the bald knuckle above the pass, scattered with the wreckage of 5 days and 5 nights, and the scrape on the lower slope was one small dark mark among 10,000 on that ground, indistinguishable to any eye that had not been there from the holes around it. And yet it was the place where the trap had failed, the single point of the single hill where the plan that was meant to swallow a corps had been beaten by one obstacle it could not account for. And the snow came down over it through the days that followed and covered the scrape, and the fan of the dead, and the whole of the hill. And the mountains kept it, the way the mountains kept everything that winter, in a cold that did not let go. The reckoning that came afterward, when the army had reached the sea, and the staffs had time to count what the mountains had taken, and what they had cost the enemy, told a story that the men in the holes had understood without numbers, and that the numbers only confirmed. The Ninth Army Group had crossed the Yalu with roughly 120,000 men in 12 divisions, a force assembled specifically to destroy the corps in a single stroke, and it had come into the mountains with the advantage of complete surprise, perfect concealment, overwhelming numerical superiority at every point of contact, and a plan so sound that even in failure it nearly worked. And it had been broken, not driven back, not merely defeated, but broken as a fighting instrument, bled out across the high ground around the reservoir, to the point where entire divisions ceased to exist as functioning formations, and had to be withdrawn from the war for months to be rebuilt from replacements. The army that had been built to swallow a corps had instead been gutted in the act of trying, and a great part of the gutting had been done not by fire but by frost, by the same winter that the concealment plan had forced the Chinese soldiers to lie down in for days before the assaults. And the staffs that tallied the cost afterward found that the cold had killed and crippled the Ninth Army Group on a scale that no battle in that war had matched. Tens of thousands of men lost to frostbite and exposure, whole units found later in their firing positions, frozen, untouched by any bullet, killed by the discipline that had brought them undetected to the line. The strategic verdict on the campaign turned, in the end, on the single fact that the road had stayed open. And the road had stayed open because the pinches had held, and the worst of the pinches had been the pass, and the pass had held because the hill above it had held, and so the entire escape of 2 divisions from a closing trap traced back, through a chain of causation that no man in the holes had needed explained to him, to a few score Marines on a bald knuckle of ground, and to the handful among them who had held the seams when the seams were all that stood between the company and dissolution. Remove the hill from the account and the chain breaks at its first link. The pass closes, the trap shuts. The regiments at the reservoir, sealed in the bowl with no road out, fight where they stand until the cold and the numbers finish them. And the campaign that became a byword for a fighting withdrawal becomes instead the byword for a corps destroyed in the mountains. And the difference between those two outcomes, the difference between an army that escaped and an army that did not, rested on whether one hill held. And the hill had held, and the men who held it had been ordinary men made to do an extraordinary thing by the simple fact that the ground they were on could not be given up. There is a clinical truth buried in that account that the war taught over and over, and that the hill taught more sharply than almost anywhere else, which is that battles of this kind are not decided by the average behavior of the average soldier, but by the refusal of a small number of men to do the reasonable thing at the decisive moment. The reasonable thing on the first night, when the assault had flowed past the lone Marine scrape and surrounded it, was to go still and hope to be missed. And had he done the reasonable thing, the seam would have opened, and the assault would have poured through it onto the crest from below, and the company would very likely have come apart in the first hour. The reasonable thing, after the grenade took his hand, was to stop fighting and become a casualty. And had he done the reasonable thing, there would have been one fewer weapon on the line. At the aid station, through 2 more nights when every weapon counted. The reasonable thing, for Davis's battalion on the exposed ridge in the second night, was to make camp and wait for daylight. Had they done the reasonable thing, the men kept alive by being kept on their feet would have frozen, and the march would have arrived too late or not at all. At every decisive point, the reasonable thing was the thing that lost the campaign. And the campaign was won, because at every decisive point, enough men refused to do it. And the lone Marine on the lower slope had refused it more completely and more times than almost anyone. And the fan of the dead in front of his scrape was the physical record of that refusal, the arithmetic of one man's unreasonableness, written across the snow in the bodies of the men his refusal had stopped. The men who survived the hill carried it with them for the rest of their lives, in the way that men carry the few hours that defined them. And the ones who had been on the lower slope, the ones who had seen the scrape and the fan of the dead around it in the gray light of that first dawn, carried a specific image that did not leave them, the image of a single hole at the center of a wheel of the enemy dead, the spokes radiating outward, the man in the hole alive against all sense. And they understood, in the way that only the men who were there could understand, that they had looked at the exact point where the trap had failed, the precise square meter of frozen ground on which a campaign had turned. They did not have words for it that did the thing justice, because there are no such words, and the war had taught them the futility of reaching for them. And so they did what soldiers do with the things that have no words, which is to fold them into the name of the place and speak the name afterward without explanation, knowing that the men who needed no explanation would understand, and the men who did would never fully understand no matter how much was said. The hill kept its name, the name carried the whole of it, and at the center of the name, unspoken, was the scrape. The final accounting of the cold deserves its own clinical close, because the cold had been the third army on that ground, and it had outlasted the other two, and it did not stop killing when the fighting stopped. The withdrawal to the sea was itself a battle against the winter as much as against the enemy, the column moving south through temperatures that fell, on the worst nights, past the threshold where exposed flesh freezes faster than a man can react to the pain of it. And the wounded in the column suffered worst of all, because a wounded man cannot generate the heat of motion that kept the walking men alive. And a man on a stretcher in that cold was a man losing his battle with the frost, even as the corpseman fought to keep his other wounds from killing him first. The morphine froze, the plasma froze, the bandages froze stiff on the wounds. Men who had survived the bullets died of the cold on the road south, and men who survived both arrived at the sea with the deep frostbite that would cost them their feet and their hands in the weeks afterward, the slow amputation of the parts the cold had killed. And the lone Marine, carried south with his ruined hand and his frozen feet, was one of the many for whom the war's ending was also the beginning of a long reckoning with what the cold had taken, the surgeries and the amputations and the permanent record of those 5 days written into the body and the missing pieces of it. The cold did not distinguish between the army it had crippled in the assault and the army it had punished in the defense. It took from both. It simply took more from the one that had been forced to lie down in it, and that asymmetry, the few degrees of margin between an enemy the cold destroyed and a defender the cold merely maimed, was one more of the quiet decisive facts on which the whole thing had turned. And so the account closes where it has to close, which is back on the hill in the snow at the scrape, after the column has passed and the rear guard has come down off the heights, and the silence of the emptied battlefield has settled over the high valley for good. The hill stands alone above the pass in the flat cold light, scattered with the wreckage of everything that happened on it, and the snow comes down over it slowly through the days that follow, filling the abandoned holes, covering the windrows of the dead, softening the churned ground of the road, erasing by degrees the marks of the 5 days and 5 nights. until the hill looks again like what it was before the first whistle, a bald and nameless knuckle of ground among 10,000 identical ones, indistinguishable to any eye that did not know. But it is not the same hill, and it will never again be nameless because of the thing that was done on it. And the snow that covers the scrape on the lower slope does not erase the scrape, it only hides it. The way the mass of the army hid the man who held it, the extraordinary folded back into the ordinary, the decisive point made indistinguishable from the ground around it. The scrape is still there under the snow. The shape of the wheel is still there. The spokes of the dead radiating out from the hub, frozen into the hill, kept by the mountains in the cold that does not let go. And somewhere on a vehicle moving south toward the sea, indistinguishable from 10,000 other wounded men, is the one who made the mark alive, carried down the road he kept open, his work finished, his hand gone, the dawn long since become day, the hill behind him holding still in the memory of every man who passed it, which is the only monument the night ever meant to raise.